I just wanted to run through a few things. Obviously with pastures, there's a lot of pastures, native pastures out there we really can't do very much with in terms of making major differences. But I want to just try and, the title about these whole talks is seasonal conditions, and to just try and put in perspective, where we are at in terms of the season and some of the trigger points that we need to keep in mind. And I know you're probably all aware of this, and it's probably just confirmation, but I find it useful to look at some actual data, and it confirms in your mind where to go. This is just a 57-year record of annual rainfall. It's up at Taree, just straight out of bomb things. And as you can see, rainfall hasn't dropped off dramatically over the last 60 years. If anything, we've done quite well in the last 10 to 15 years. But in that period, there's a few very low ones, and there's a lot, not too bad, right? So one of the biggest problems in dry conditions is doom and gloom, and I think we really have to be aware that, at least in my experience, in that time I've been here, is things can change very quickly here. And we're seeing we've gone from extremely dry to extremely wet, and that's the nature of the coast from my experience. I spent 16 years out at Deniliquin. Every summer was dry, every winter you got a bit of rain, sometimes it was late, sometimes it wasn't. But here things can turn around very quickly, although we do have seasonal patterns. When we look at this sort of data, we get year-round depth, like 12-month droughts very seldom. I think the last really bad one was in about 1965 that people talk to me about. A lot of times we'll get 6 months droughts, but so our triggers are, we've got a very, very high probability of getting rain February, January, February. Would anybody, so February, March, anyone disagree? So it tells us that in the worst case scenario, we've got until then before we can see some green feed. But we've also got a pretty reasonable chance of getting rain and some feed in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and we're seeing that happening. And I just think it's important to not to just sort of look at the doom and gloom and to say, look, there is a possibility we could get buckets of rain. Look what's happening up north. And things could turn around very quickly. It may be short term, it may be, quite a change in the season. But it's about saying, okay, being prepared for things can change quite rapidly and make the most of it. So when I put this through a pasture growth model, which is just a mathematical model that says, okay, given all those years, what would Kikuyu do? And again, we get production over those 57 years is actually pretty level, but we do get 1, 2, 3 out of the 57 which are really, really quite drastic. Again, it's just saying that, okay, a 3-month drought is very common, a 6-month drought is reasonably common, but 12 months is very, very common. And I'm talking on the coast, all right? So, but I think that does apply down here to West Bengal. So just putting that in perspective, and I'll come back to some figures later where I've seen things just turn around very quickly. But, and then preparing these slides, I did it before. We've actually had a little bit of rain up at Taree, and it's surprising how quickly things have responded. And I'll talk a bit about some of the things that you can anticipate, what country will respond best and to take that on board. But obviously, the priority, if we didn't get any more rain, is retaining ground cover. There is a point where cattle are in a paddock and they're just not going to gain weight. So why keep them in there? Why keep dropping the ground cover? Actually, if we end up getting down to very poor ground cover, and you do get rain, you get more runoff. And if we're in a period where we're getting sort of 20 mils and we lose that for runoff, what's the point of that? So there is a point where you really have to say, look, I'm not getting any more animal gain out of them. I'm better off taking them off the paddock, leaving some ground cover there. And in the long run, those paddocks will respond better. And ground cover doesn't necessarily have to be just green grass. You can see in the top photo there's some dead dead matter there that actually provides that level of cover. But certainly when pastures get below 5 centimetres high, cattle really can't get very much out of it. And that's a really important trigger to keep in mind. So, yeah, we've talked about destocking, and a lot of most of you probably already sold cattle that you can sell. So you're probably at a reasonably low level of carrying capacity at the moment. And if we do get rain, you'll and this, just driving down here this morning, there's 1,001 different situations that I look at as in paddocks. Some people have still got quite reasonable feed. Some have got good Kikuyu paddocks that are starting to respond. And others, yeah, it's just native grasses, and no matter how much rain we get, they're not going to respond dramatically because the fertility is just not there. But it does make sense if in a situation like this, when we're going into a rainfall event, and let's, we've got reasonable predictions of rain for Friday. We've already had, 25 mils last weekend. Add those two together and I'll show you it can be quite significant in terms of dry matter production that we can get. But, keeping stock off those paddocks for that 2 or 3 weeks to allow it to respond can be one of the most important things you do. If a paddock is, and I should have had a slide of this, but if pastures that are kept this low by grazing, they're never going to reach their peak. But if you can get them up to 10 or 15 centimetres high, they can really put on a lot of dry matter very quickly. So removing stock and allowing it to get enough leaf area to really start growing can make quite a bit of difference in terms of what you actually get off that paddock. And the difficulty is when you've got stock on a paddock, is you're not really sure how fast it's growing. Like we do a lot of cut trials where we fence the cattle out, and we can see that, and on a dairy obviously you see the pasture growing, there's no stock. But if there's stock in the paddock, sometimes you just don't know what's been grown because it's just been taken off all the time. But the bottom line is, if we do get a good rain, and the pastures never get beyond that, you're not going to utilise that rain the best you can. You need to get leaf area there, you need to get reasonable growth, and you need it there for intake anyway. So if you do have pastures like Kikuyu that are going to respond well, then they're the ones that you pull them off and you put them on the the dry country or the poorer country, because they're not going to do that much damage, but you can make a lot of difference in those better pastures.
Excuse me, does that say you need 50 to 100 millimetres of pasture? Or is that
of rain? Yeah.
Rain, oh, right.
I'll quantify that a little bit more. Yeah. Okay, just looking at our overall season, this is the lovely graph showing that's the 90 percentile rainfall for rain over that 60-year period. This is the 50 percentile and the 10 percentile. So the very worst we can get nothing. But and obviously in this period here we're getting about half of what we get there, and this is a little bit in excess, and this is well below what we need. So our general picture is, okay, the springs are dry, we know that, but the thing that we don't often consider is how much rain is stored in the soil profile already, and that you can, coming out of a Kikuyu or a pasture coming out of winter can still have moisture at depth, and you don't need as much rain as you think to really make those pastures kick away. This is just some data that, our typical soil moisture profile over 100 years if we model it, and it's very typical to have dry conditions right at this time, but you all know that we can get these November, December storms, and over 100 years data we do get a peak, and that peak can be really quite significant. When you model that, or when you look at over a period of years, you model it out, we do get some really drastic seasons, but we also get quite a lot where we do get quite reasonable conditions for growth. And that's if your pasture's fertile and well enough to handle it, Another way of looking at that is, again, from that data okay, worst case scenario, you get very little growth. This is Kikuyu. But look at the means of the average. Even despite all that dry period, we can still get quite reasonable growth from a rainfall point of view in September and October, on average. Now, we're certainly tracking on the low part, but as I said, things can turn around. And this is an example of a year down in at Taree 2004 that I did some water use efficiency work, where we actually monitored the soil water in the profile. This is March, we got about 130 millimetres, it filled it all up. We got virtually no rain until July, a couple of little events, and by the end of October we had nothing. That was a ryegrass pasture, it was going into sorghum. But lo and behold, we got about 150 millimetres. The soil was able to store that, and everything turned around. Like what looked terrible turned around quite a lot. And I've seen that happen a few times. So I just think it's really important not to be too doom and gloom. But if we get to Christmas and it's still this dry, obviously, yeah, we're in trouble, you know that. Right. But things can things can change, and they can change dramatically. And some of the options that we were talking about with sorghum and the other things, they can come in and you can utilise that rainfall very, very well. Rob McLaren, I'll be talking, he has maize growers and sorghum growers who year in, year out grow, really quite decent crops of both on dry land and on the coast. So how much rain do we need? There's certain factors that govern how much production we can get off a pasture, and roughly speaking for Kikuyu, a practical estimate is roughly 30 kilograms of dry matter can be produced for every millimetre of rainfall, provided the Kikuyu is fertile. Ryegrass can do about 20. I'll show you some other figures later. So if we only get 30 millimetres of rain and nothing more, you could potentially grow in fertile conditions 900 kilograms of dry matter. If we get 50, you're up around 1,500 kilograms of dry matter. So that's enough on a dairy farm for a good grazing. That's Kikuyu that high, really quite fertile. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So obviously, that's what we're looking for. We want that sort of rainfall. We know we're into very high moisture, but if we do get those sort of rainfall events and you've got some good soil depth, you can really make those pastures grow, provided they're fertile enough. And we can go down the line. You remember, and one of the things to bear in mind too, if you have a deep alluvial flat and it can store 100, and in that example I showed you before, those soils at Taree on the river were storing 150 millimetres of water from that rainfall event. It's sitting there and it can produce a lot of feed for the next couple of months. So, potentially 3,000, 4,500 kilograms of dry matter produced just from what was stored in the soil. And we often don't think about that and the potential. And when you start looking at paddocks for things like sorghum that Rob will talk about, that's one of the critical things. And it's why we can get out of a lot of trouble if we get that sort of rain. Okay, so the summer options, as I see it, is obviously native pastures are going to do what they're going to do because the fertility's not there. But if you have got Kikuyu and Soteria, I'll show you some figures where we can turn things around a lot. Sorghums and millets really fit paddocks that are otherwise doing not very much. I wouldn't be trying to put sorghums and millets in the top of something like Kikuyu, but if you have paddocks that are either bean cropping or they've had ryegrass and there's not much Kikuyu, and we do get the sorts of rains that's possible, and that they got it up at Lismore just the other day, it's really quite high rainfall events, then these things can really be quite useful provided you put the inputs in that are needed. Tanya will be talking about chicory and lucerne, what can you get out of that? And cowpeas, yeah, it has some options in terms of preparing paddocks for ryegrass next year. Okay, so what can you expect out of these things? Again, these are water use efficiency figures, and if we're after bulk and we're after just getting the most of the rain, Kikuyu is actually pretty good, and you don't have the establishment figures there. but it has to be reasonably fertile and it has to have had fertility behind. If you go into an old Kikuyu paddock that has never had it, hasn't had anything for a long time, you can need a lot of urea to get it going, because there's a lot of, well, it's already low fertility anyway, but it needs a lot of nitrogen to tie it, that gets tied up in the stubble that's already there. But yeah, I have grown Kikuyu, measured those sort of dry matter, and it is quite possible to produce that in a really, if you get 400 millimetres of rain at the right time, but I'll have some caveats. The beauty of sorghums and those sort of things is, particularly if you do have paddocks where you've got soil stored moisture and you put a fair bit of effort into them, and they can produce a lot of dry matter over the year. And obviously chicory and lucerne, if they're already established, then just make the most of that, and I'll leave that up to but things like cowpeas, going back into those figures, when we look at these things, if you're after bulk of feed, then these are the options. These are great, much better quality, but they're not going to produce the bulk of feed that the others do. So I've said Kikuyu is great, and here's some figures that this was on a trial that I was doing on a dairy farm last year, coming out of that really, really dry period. We had urea rates. This basically had nothing. Here we were putting roughly 30 kilograms of N on per month, 60 kilograms of N on per month, all right? And we got that wonderful rain, and the dairy farmers I was working with went out. We didn't know whether we were going to get more rain, or it was just 100, I think it was wasn't that much. It was about 30 or 40 millimetres of rain initially, and then it got some really good follow-up. But no one knew what we would get. So they put on urea, and we got roughly a tonne, and nearly, I think it was 1,800, I've got the figures over here, 1,100 kilograms of dry matter extra, 1,850. That cost at 570, it costs $37 for urea, which works out $30 a tonne in dry matter. It's a lot cheaper than buying hay or grain. And $74, $25 a tonne, very cheap feed. If you've got really good conditions, if you've got the paddock that can respond, it's the cheapest feed that you can grow. But if you recall, last year we had had 5 harvests, not much of a response here. About half the response we're talking there in December. We had really dry January, not much at all. So you're not going to do these sorts of things unless you know you've got that good 50 millimetres of rain. A friend of mine rang me last week and he said, I think it's going to do, we're going to get 20 mils of rain. Should I put urea on? I said, I wouldn't, I wouldn't. On a 20 mil event, I wouldn't. But if you've had 20 mils and we're going to get another 20 mils, then I'd be considering it, because you've got roughly that 50 millimetres of rainfall that's going to produce a grazing. All right, so they're just things to keep in mind. It's not everything, and I've already mentioned those things pretty well.